Welcome to this session, which is called Religion and Medical Ethics, and its reflections on autonomy and authority. My name is Julian Hughes. I'm by profession, I'm an old age psychiatrist. I'm now retired from clinical practice, but I'm still associated with the University of Bristol and the University of Newcastle in the United Kingdom. And I study philosophy as well as studying medicine. I'm just going to give a little bit of background, and then I'll speak for up to about 10 minutes, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues, Professor Comaretto and Professor Garley, and they'll each speak for 10 minutes as well. The little bit of background, which some of you will know very well, is that last December there was a joint symposium held in Rome. It was a joint symposium between WISH and the Pontifical Academy for Life. And it was looking at issues of old age and mental health, especially at the end of life, and looking at the ethical foundations for making decisions for other people. Before that, and the other people involved in the symposium were the British Medical Journal. And I was involved with the British Medical Journal because I'm associated with the Journal of Medical Ethics. And I'm saying all that because there was a paper published just before the symposium as a background paper. And then after the symposium, there's been another put out, which has looked at some of the issues that arose in the context of that previous symposium. And the issue that we're really thinking about is the tension between, on the one hand, autonomy, being able to have control over your life and making decisions for yourself, and on the other hand, the notion of authority. So we're thinking of the authority of, say, families, the authority of social groups, and also the authority of religious faith traditions. And we saw a bit of a tension between that. One of the things that was, to use an expression which I'm not sure to what extent it's familiar in other countries, but the expression of the elephant in the room. So the elephant in the room in the previous symposium was that there might be a very big contradiction between secular medical ethics and religious type medical ethics when it came to end of life decisions. So that was one of the issues which we wanted to draw out to some extent. So we've set ourselves 3 questions, and I'll just go through those questions one at a time. And in a way, what I'm doing is setting out the material that's in the post-symposium paper that we published. So in the first part of that paper, we wrote about, there was a lot about the notion of autonomy. Now, autonomy is seen as being an absolute, steadfast principle underpinning liberal democratic traditions. And what I wanted to do in that paper was just to question that a bit. So when people put forward that liberal democratic ideal of autonomy, they often refer to the 2 philosophers, Locke and Kant. And I'm not going to get into this in great detail, but when we look at what Locke actually said, he said we should have autonomy in the sense of freedom, but only if it's not having an effect on other people's freedom. So Locke himself recognized that there were boundaries to the notion of autonomy. If then we look at what Kant said about autonomy, it's quite, as always with Kant, it's quite technical, but he was actually, when he talked about autonomy in connection with morals, he was really thinking about reason. And so he was, and in particular, and the main thing he said about morals was this idea of what he called the categorical imperative, which were the sort of, were the demands of morality on each of us set by reason. So he also, in a way, puts boundaries to autonomy. It's what is set by reason and what other people would have to, what he said any rational person would want to agree with. So So the answer, so the question we put to ourselves was, is autonomy a useful notion? Is it a useful concept? And how is it useful? And so my initial response to that is to say, well, actually, it looks as though autonomy, of course, is a useful notion, but there do seem to be boundaries to it. And therefore, I wanted to emphasize one of the topics that was raised in the previous symposium, which is the notion of relational autonomy. That we do have autonomy, it's very important, but we always stand in relationship with other people. So there are always boundaries to our sense of autonomy. So having said that, I just want to move on to the next question, which we've highlighted, which is thinking about the end of life, and then wondering to what extent do we agree that there are other people or institutions like families and faith traditions and so on, whose authority might overrule or at least rightly influence the decision making for somebody who obviously who can't make decisions for themselves. And so I think here what I would want to say is, so we have our notion of autonomy, so we still want to say that the person themselves is center stage, they are the most important person, but the person is always embedded in a context, and it's a context of family, tradition, culture, morals, laws, and so forth. So although we want to support the person as much as we can doing what he or she wants and so on, we have to also respect the fact, and it's not really respecting, it's more acknowledge the fact that that person isn't an isolated atom, but is part of this bigger whole, and that that bigger whole, that context, will have an effect. So even if the person has capacity, if he or she is part of this context, they will themselves wish to abide by the precepts that are set out in that broader concept. And if the person lacks capacity, then it might be for others, aware of what the person, him or herself, might want, but also to implement their decisions within the context of the broader tradition. So again, I think that the way in which we're embedded or situated is very important here. And then finally, the third question was thinking specifically about suicide, assisted suicide, euthanasia. And I wanted to raise the question whether there was any compromise between respect for autonomy and the dictates of religious authorities. And my answer is, perhaps there is. This may be me being just very, very optimistic, but it may be that we can bring the two sides a little bit closer together. So if we have a broader notion of autonomy, which brings in other people, and if, on the other hand, religious traditions, for instance, recognize the importance of the person, but also the fact that the person is embedded in these other contexts, it may be that we can get some useful, at least get some useful conversation going between what might appear as a very secular tradition and, on the other hand, a religious faith tradition. And so I'm thinking that, for instance, discussions about concepts which religions are very good on, like dignity, might actually be quite useful, even in a more secular context. That it may be that secular institutions have not thought as deeply about issues like dignity as perhaps other faith traditions have. That's just a sort of supposition. I'm making this contrast between the secular and the religious because that was there in that first symposium. So those are my thoughts about those three questions. And I've reached the end of my 10 minutes, so I'm going to leave it there and hand over to Professor Comaretto, who will introduce herself, and then she'll address those same questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning to the organizers and to the delegates. My name is Nunziata Comoretto. I'm a physician and bioethicist. My field of expertise is especially in clinical ethics, and I'm an official and researcher at the Pontifical Academy for Life in Vatican. So thank you for the questions, and answering the first question, I can say that the concept of autonomy is of course useful and must be taken into account because it reflects an essential quality of the human being. Culturally, there has been an increasing attention to this principle, both inside and out of medicine. What we discuss from a medical ethics point of view is not the relevance of the autonomy as a concept, obviously, but how this concept should be interpreted within the clinical relationship. We know that there are ethical perspectives that consider autonomy as an absolute principle, making it the leading criterion for medical action. The risk in this case is a too abstract reading of the autonomy. It is true that the human being has freedom as an intrinsic quality, but it is equally true that the time of the choice, the exercise of freedom is conditioned by several factors we have to take into account. That's why the patient's self-determination is not so much the starting point of the clinical relationship as its end point. The relationship between doctor and patient has the responsibility to accompany the patient towards a choice that be as much autonomous as possible. So it is the binomial of medical indication and patient's autonomy that is most likely to meet the patient's best interest, not just one or the other separately considered. This is the first issue. About the second questions, if at the end of life, should there be other people or institution whose authority might overrule or influence decision making? My reflections say that autonomy, as we said, represents such a precious quality of the human being that it cannot be overruled by any other agency. Freedom in its deepest moral meaning, not just as a personal preference. So the moral meaning of freedom has much to do with the moral consciousness, that is the true identity of each human being as a person. Other people or institutions can be significant in supporting the patient's autonomous choice, in helping him or her to balance the different elements that come into play in every human choice, even the medical decision, so that such a choice is consistent with the patient's value system. True autonomy is an achievement, is the result of a process where we receive the help of many others. About the third questions regarding suicide, assisted suicide and euthanasia, and if it is possible any compromise between autonomy and the dictates of religious authorities. We can say that one of the problems with assisted suicide and euthanasia is that they require the involvement of another person who must carry out or at least participate in the action. It is clear that legally authorizing an action contrary to the protection of human life, which is one of the fundamental ethical commitments of healthcare professionals. So, authorizing such actions without admitting the possibility of conscious objection means at least violating the freedom of the doctor. And this is unfair because it would mean overruling the doctor's freedom that deserve the same dignity and respect than the patient's one. We know that major religious traditions oppose to these practices for reasons that we cannot address here. This opposition, however, does not mean ignoring the suffering of patients who come to ask for euthanasia or assisted suicide. The main religious traditions affirm that euthanasia and assisted suicide mean abandoning the patient to his or her suffering. They are false compassion, rather than looking at the suffering of those around us with responsibility and solidarity. Taking care is the only possible answer according to the major religions. A few years ago, the Pontifical Academy for Life started a project dedicated to palliative care with the aim to culturally promote the attitude of taking care. In this project, called PAL Life, the WISH program is an active and important partner. It is precisely within this project that took place the scientific event and the report that we are discussing now in this session. These are my answers. Thank you.
Well, that was splendid, partly because you still had a couple of minutes spare. So thank you very much for that. It helps to keep us on time. A question's been raised about whether we can pin the background document. And I've said, I know I have it somewhere, but I'm a bit loath to do it at the minute because I think I'll crash my computer or something. So that's something I'm sure we can sort out after the event, if that's all right. But can I now hand over to Professor Ghali? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I am Mohammed Ghali. I am Professor of Islam and Biomedical Ethics in the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics at Hamad bin Khalifa University. My background is, unlike my colleagues who have interdisciplinary background, I'm just monodisciplinary. My background is in Islamic studies and religious studies. And then I moved to the interplay of religion, in this case, Islam and bioethics. I will not be able to neatly distinguish between the three questions, so I'll go forth and back between the questions. But of course, I'll do my best to stick to the 10-minute time. The first question that we need to ask, and this is puts religious traditions, including Islam and other like Christianity and Judaism, a little bit in a defensive position. Do religions, and I speak here about Islam in particular, know the concept of autonomy? Or is it just that God dictates in the religious people should just follow? Without the concept of autonomy, the broad understanding of the concept of autonomy, belief wouldn't be possible. To start with, so in Islam, if the person is not did not choose for this belief or belief in this religion autonomously, freely, without compulsion from other external factors, this will not be true belief. So without autonomy, there will be no religion. There will be no religion. And within the religion itself, so if we speak about the practices, it should also be done without coercion and without compulsion. So for instance, if we speak about marriage and marital contract, which is not just a civil contract, but it's a religious one, once you are married to your partner, this would create automatically a number of obligations and rights in front of God, not only in front of the court or the law, etc. In order to make this contract recognized by Islam, one of the conditions is that the people would do this autonomously also, and so on and so forth. Autonomy is there and is central. The key difference, add to this also about the body, which is our main concern here. In Islam, and I believe in other religious traditions, the owner of the body with an uppercase A is not the human being. And this usually what makes the big fuss that religions do not consider autonomy over body. So we are not the owners of our bodies because the owner is the one who created the body, that's God. Does this mean that I have no autonomy over my body? The question is definitely no. I still have autonomy over my body because it's not God who will come and control how my body works every time or in every incident. I have the capacity over my body as the trustee, the one who has been trusted by God to take care of this body and to make use of this body. But the position of a trustee is different than that of the owner. The trustee has the full freedom to do whatever he or she wants with the body as long as it does not violate the guidelines of the owner. That's the main problem which will happen. So there is autonomy in religion to get in, there is autonomy within and inside religion, and there is autonomy over the body. But relational autonomy here, not only in relation to family, but also in relation to God. The main difference between secular and religious perspectives to autonomy over body here is their moral framework at the level of meta-ethics, as we say. So what informs me that I have autonomy over my body is that I was granted this autonomy by God within religion. If we speak about secular, this God factor is not there. But this would never mean that in secular ethics or secular morality that I can do whatever I like. Not in religious, not in secular perspectives. We have the very clear example now of COVID-19 pandemic. We cannot use the argument of autonomy to do whatever we like. Because if this will harm the public health, by law, you are put under pressure that you cannot do this. We have never been able to fly for a couple of months, unlike what humans used to do now for decades. But we stick to that, even if it is against our autonomy and even against our convention. The same also in religion, but because of the difference in meta-ethics, we see differences in applications. When it comes to the point of end-of-life care in particular, in end-of-life care, what adds to the complexity of the problem of autonomy and decision-making is the person in question can have some problems with the mental capacity of decision-making. The person is not in a position to take the decisions, or at least this is how we judge it. In the Islamic tradition, legal capacity, ahliya, as we call it in Arabic, is not a static and is not a fixed term. So the person can lose the ahliya, the legal capacity, permanently, and sometimes he can lose it temporarily, and can lose it completely and can lose it partially. So it's not the case that whenever we have mental problems or disorders, it means that the person is not in a position to take decision. As long as the person can understand the information given by the physician, can process it, make decision accordingly, and communicate this decision, then there is autonomy. It can be that the person will not have autonomy, for instance, over religious obligations like praying or fasting, because you don't have the capacity to do that. But it doesn't mean that everybody can decide on your behalf in everything else. This is one of the misconceptions, not only by physicians, but even sometimes family members in a Muslim context. So now when it comes to the last question about euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, etc., we go back to the moral framework. Once the person decides to have God as integral part of his or her moral world, then you have to be consistent. If I decided to be part of the medical profession, then I have to stick to professional codes of physicians. If I don't do that, then I'm not ethical, I'm not consistent in my thinking and in my behavior. So once you have God in and believe in God in, there is divine agency. So the one who gives life is the one who takes life.
Mohammed,
yes.
Just to let you know, it's the 2 minutes.
Yes.
Okay.
I'll conclude.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So if the one who gave life said that life can be taken only under this and this and this condition, and conditions are not fulfilled, then the act will not be ethical. Even if I give my consent, the physician give the consent, family give the consent, the state permit that, the acts will be maybe legal, but it will never be consistent with the moral world that the person autonomously choose to commit himself or herself to. I will stop here, and whenever we have questions, we can go again over some of the points I mentioned or you mentioned. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. That still leaves us a little bit of time. At the moment on the chat board, we don't have any questions. So if anybody's listening and wants to raise a question, please feel free. Now's the chance. We've still got we've still got a good 15 minutes for questions. I just want to pick up just a couple of things. Just Mohammed, if you don't mind. So what would be your attitude towards? I completely understand and agree with what you've said, that if a person has committed to a particular faith tradition and they've done that freely and so on, then they should stick to the rules and the traditions. But what would be your attitude then to a state? And I'm thinking, in some ways, I'm thinking about our situation here in the UK at the moment, where every now and again there is a push, and it's the same in other countries, there's a push to bring in euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. And it's difficult to know how to react to that if you're somebody with a faith tradition. Do you just say, well, most of my society does not share my faith, therefore we allow it? Or how do we, as it were, combat it if we want to, if we're in a sort of minority faith? I suppose there's a difference between your faith being in the minority and your faith being in the majority. But I just wondered for some reflections on that.
This is a real case ethical dilemma that I experience it, because I'm Egyptian, but I'm also Dutch. So I moved to the Netherlands in 2000, and the law was, I think, enacted 2002. Just 1 or 2 years after I arrived. So we had these discussions in the Netherlands. Yeah. It is the first country that legalized active euthanasia, if we say. My position is the following, and it has been the following. First of all, I should have the freedom to express my own position. So if I'm a Muslim, if I'm a Jew, if I'm a Christian, and I believe that this is not in alignment with my religious values and religious norms, I should be able to express this, and it should be part of the public discussions. Once it is done, and this was the case in the Netherlands, because you are still in a minority. By the way, some secularist bioethics had also the same position, but for other reasons, like, for instance, slippery slope argument, etc. At the end, you are in a minority position who are against, and then it will be approved. They approved that you can ask for. This does not put any pressure on me as a Muslim to still not to make use of it. As a patient, but the problem here will be for the physician. So here comes the issue. If the physician is Muslim or Catholic or Jew or whatever, these people should be able to make use of the conscientious objection. That this is a principle that's recognized in bioethics in general. This is how we dealt with when I was in the Netherlands at this time.
Right. That's very interesting. Almost to go back to the start, it sounds as though we're all in agreement, both that autonomy is a very key concept for all of us, and yet we recognize that it's always within a sort of context. And I think, Nunziata, I think you almost said that. You said autonomy can be too abstract and not seen as, in a kind of real context. So I think it's interesting that there is that sort of agreement about the notion of autonomy, and the way it's never just an abstract principle. It's always in the context of other things, other beliefs, not just other beliefs, but also other practical things that may or may not be going on. Do you want to comment on that, or should we leave it?
Sorry, I missed the last words.
I was just, we don't have to discuss that again, because I think we've all agreed about the importance of autonomy, but that it's always within a context. So it's always relational in a sense.
Yes.
Okay.
And also about, I think, not only the relation, but the true existential situation of the sick person.
Yeah.
Who is not just, autonomy is not just a flow chart.
Yeah.
It's something very human, very concrete. Yeah.
Well, if you allow me, Dr.
Yes.
Julian, the point also that I wanted to highlight is that autonomy is that you choose.
Yeah.
Be able to choose and make your decisions without compulsion, undue influence, etc. This is something, and to believe that all the time this should be done by the individual and individual only, this is the great misconception. Because I may decide autonomously that my family should be involved. It's me who decided that. Because what's the point? I want to get comfort. I want to feel, I want to minimize my suffering, and having these people around me, involving them in my decision making. This is all important, and I do that. Because sometimes in the West, we think that if you don't do it individually or even individualistically, it means no autonomy. It's in my autonomy, in the capacity of my individual autonomy, that I think about the hereafter, not only this life. So if I want to end temporal suffering now, it shouldn't be at the cost of everlasting suffering in the hereafter, if I want to make a comparison. So autonomy is not just one individual taking the decision alone without considering the others. Otherwise, there is no autonomy. And I think now I had discussion with Tom Beecham at Georgetown. I met him in person, and he told me that in the beginning this was not clear, but now they speak about the thin and the thick understanding of autonomy. The thin understanding of autonomy is more or less individualism. But the thick understanding of autonomy is open to incorporate these nuances and differences.
Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful. At the symposium in Rome, there was a man called Professor Rahman Gillen. I don't know if he's watching this, he may or may not be, but he was the great person in the UK for making people aware of the 4 principles of medical ethics from Beecham and Childress. And one of the things he objected to in the talk of relational autonomy was the thought that this might allow other people to take away the decision-making from the person. And his point was that autonomy should be, in the phrase that you've just used, it should be thick, it should be understood in a thick manner, so that my autonomy will inevitably involve me being partial to and accepting of, for instance, my family making decisions for me as well, and that so that's going to be, so his point was that's going to be part of autonomy, whereas he was worried that the notion of relational autonomy stopped it being autonomy of the person and made it the autonomy of the relations. Whereas he said it should still be the person's autonomy, but the person themselves will naturally, unless there's some problem in the family, the person themselves will naturally want their relations to be involved and will abide by things that the relations believe and feel are true, because you're at one with it's presumed you're at one with your relations, as it were.
Exactly.
We still don't have any other questions, so we did have some other things we thought we might talk about, and one of them was the notion of dignity. And I just wanted to raise that because, again, in debates about dignity in the UK, it can be a very sort of, both sides in the euthanasia physician-assisted suicide debate use the word dignity. And so there are organisations in favour of euthanasia who are called Dignity in Dying and so forth. And they say, well, you can't die with dignity unless you have euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. But on the other hand, as we noted in the background paper, there are religious writers who talk about intrinsic dignity, and which means that dignity can never be taken away from you, even if you're very ill and so forth. And so there's a tension over the notion of dignity, and I thought it'd be interesting to hear your reflections on that. Nunziata, do you want to have a go at that and see where we get to?
Maybe we could say that dignity is the true absolute value in a personalist ethical perspective. This is very different from utilitarian ethical perspective, where dignity can change during among person and during the life of the same person according to different criteria of health, social status, also medical prognosis, quality of life in general, and so on. So I think that it's very necessary a debate and a reflection in the medical ethics field on the meaning of this word of dignity, because this is a very used and abused maybe concept in medical ethics, but we don't give the same meaning. There is no full ethical agreement on the meaning and the role that this concept should have in medical decision making.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. It does seem to be an important area for us to try to, as it were, sort out, because it's often used in a sort of propaganda-like way, that if you see somebody who's very, very dependent physically, mentally, you can say, well, look, they don't have any dignity. But that's begging the question, isn't it? Mohammed, do you want to add to that?
Yes. In Islam, dignity is a God-given thing. It's not something that you acquire as an individual. You are born with dignity. And it's God who gave you this dignity because of the very fact of your humanness, that you are part of the human species. So outside your religious affiliation, rich or poor, tall or short, as long as you are part of the human species, you are dignified, you have dignity. When we discuss about dignity by the end of life care, usually the idea, at least the underlying idea, is that dignity means no suffering. So if we suffer, we have to minimize. If we cannot put it to an end, then it's better to die. And here is a big problem, because we are not only a reductionist understanding of dignity, but a reductionist understanding of suffering. The great volume of suffering that we have in life is not because of a disease. We have wars in our life. People suffer because of social, political, financial reasons, much more than because of medical reasons. But by the end of my life, maybe the source of my suffering is that I don't have my friends and family around me. Not because I have this pain or the disease. If you link suffering to less dignity, then we have to be consistent. And we have to open it up for dying with dignity whenever we have suffering. And I don't think anybody with common sense would come to this conclusion, because we will all at a moment be eligible to ask for terminating our life. So it's a reductionist understanding of what suffering is and reductionist understanding of what dignity is. This would be my thesis, I would say.
We're coming towards the end. We only have a interesting point. I'm aware of people who are starting to look a little bit more at the notion of suffering and asking the question. It's a difficult question to ask in a sort of secular context, but whether there's some point to suffering sometimes, that some of us might accept a certain amount of suffering as being a positive thing. It's very difficult to say that in the face of somebody who's distressed and suffering, but nevertheless, there might be some sort of role. In about 1 minute, Nunziata, do you want to say anything about that?
Okay, suffering, I cannot say that suffering is in itself a positive thing, but we have learned that suffering can become an opportunity to learn very important things about our life that usually we miss in other situations, maybe when we are healthy, when we don't face difficulties. And so we have to fight suffering with ethical means, and as COVID pandemic show us, maybe learn lesson and take opportunity to grow in humanity.
So we have to fight suffering, but nevertheless, there may be something also positive about suffering for us as human beings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Spiritual meanings, for example, relationships, appreciate values that we don't consider usually in our life. Many important lessons comes with suffering, not only physical suffering, but in the medical field, of course, we have to treat pain to alleviate suffering, psychological, existential suffering, of course.
Yeah. Well, I think we're down to about 1 minute, so I don't think we can really start a new conversation unless we each want to speak for 20 seconds about something. But for my part, I'd just like to say that who knows whether we're being watched by 20 million people or it's just the three of us. But I've certainly benefited from hearing both of your views. It reminds me of the symposium in Rome and of how interesting it was to get different perspectives, but to find so much in common between those perspectives. So thank you both very much. Do either of you want to say a final word before we get cut off? Mohammed.
No, I just want to thank you so much for having me in this panel, and I learned myself also as you did. So I enjoyed it, and I would recommend the audience who are watching us to read the background piece and to consult it. It has very good insights.
Thank you very much for having it. Nunziata, anything else you want to add?
No, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Very important, and I recommend to pay attention to such ethical questions, that issues that are very, very important. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
And
thank you so much.
To anybody who's listening, thank you very much for being part of this as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.